George Harrison versus Paul McCartney, two of the greatest musical minds in history, locked in a creative struggle that defined the end of the Beatles. On the surface, they were part of a unified front, delivering some of the most iconic music of the 20th century. But beneath the surface, a deeper conflict was brewing. This video is going to dive into that tension, focusing on their clash over creative control, particularly during the tumultuous Let It Be sessions, where their differences reached a boiling point. So buckle up, because this story is one of clashing egos, unspoken frustrations, and a battle for artistic freedom. By the late 1960s, the Beatles were no longer the tight-knit group of friends they had once been. Each member had grown in different directions, musically, personally, and spiritually. Paul McCartney had increasingly assumed a leadership role, especially after the death of their manager, Brian Epstein, in 1967. With no clear figure guiding the band, Paul stepped up, determined to keep the group moving forward. But what started as a noble effort to preserve the Beatles soon became a source of conflict, particularly with George Harrison, who had long felt overshadowed by the Lennon-McCartney duo. George had always been the quiet Beatle, but by the late 60s, he was anything but quiet when it came to his frustrations. Early in the Beatles' career, George had accepted his role as the lead guitarist, contributing his distinctive playing to tracks mostly written by John and Paul. But as he matured as a songwriter, George began to resent the limited space he was given. By the time Let It Be rolled around, George had already penned some of his greatest songs, including While My Guitar Gently Weeps, Here Comes the Sun, and Something. Yet, he constantly found himself having to fight for recognition within the band. The Let It Be sessions, filmed for what was supposed to be a documentary about the Beatles' return to their roots, quickly turned into a chronicle of a band on the brink of collapse. The documentary captured the tension, particularly between George and Paul. Paul, who had taken on a more dominant role, would often direct the sessions, telling the others how he wanted things to sound. George, who was tired of being told what to play, snapped back. One of the most famous moments of tension came when George, clearly frustrated, told Paul, "I'll play whatever you want me to play, or I won't play at all. Whatever it is that will please you, I'll do it." The sarcasm in George's voice was palpable, and it marked a turning point in their relationship. But how did it come to this? To understand, we need to look at the dynamics within the Beatles during this period. Paul's need for control wasn't just about ego, it was also about his desire to keep the band together. The Beatles had lost their manager, their direction, and to some extent, their sense of unity. Paul took it upon himself to fill that void. He saw the Let It Be project as a way to reignite the band's creative spark. The idea was simple: strip away the complex studio production and get back to basics. The band would perform live in the studio, capturing the raw energy that had made them famous in the first place. However, Paul's vision wasn't shared by everyone, especially George. For George, the Let It Be sessions represented yet another instance of his contributions being sidelined. He had grown tired of being told what to do, especially as he had proven himself capable of writing songs that could stand toe-to-toe with Lennon-McCartney classics. But Paul's controlling nature during these sessions left little room for George to express himself. To make matters worse, John Lennon, George's other primary songwriting collaborator, was largely disengaged during the sessions. John was distracted by his relationship with Yoko Ono and his own personal issues, leaving Paul and George to clash over the band's direction. It wasn't just a battle of musical ideas, it was a battle over identity. Paul was trying to maintain the Beatles' unity, clinging to the idea of the group as a cohesive unit. George, on the other hand, was ready to break free and carve out his own identity as an artist. He had already started working with other musicians, including his close friend Eric Clapton, and was eager to explore musical styles that didn't fit into the Beatles' framework. Indian music, spirituality, and a desire for more complex, introspective songwriting were becoming central to George's creative process, and he felt stifled by Paul's insistence on simplicity and structure. One could argue that this tension had been building for years. Throughout the Beatles' career, George's songs had often been relegated to B-sides or squeezed into albums as afterthoughts. Even masterpieces like While My Guitar Gently Weeps had to fight for space on the White Album. During the Let It Be sessions, George's patience had run out. He was no longer willing to be treated as the junior partner in a band where he felt he had earned his place as an equal. The breaking point came when George briefly quit the band in January 1969. The tension with Paul had reached unbearable levels, and George walked out of the studio, telling the others, "See you round the clubs." His departure sent shockwaves through the group. While he returned after a few days, it was clear that the Beatles were no longer functioning as a cohesive unit. The tensions between George and Paul, once simmering below the surface, had now boiled over. Despite the tension, it's important to note that both George and Paul respected each other's talents. Their clashes were not born out of hatred, but out of frustration. George wanted the creative freedom he felt he deserved, and Paul wanted to hold on to the band that had defined his life. In many ways, their conflict was inevitable. As George's confidence as a songwriter grew, so did his desire for control over his own work. Paul, who had always been the driving force behind the band's direction, found it difficult to relinquish that control. The Let It Be sessions may have marked the end of the Beatles as a band, but they also marked the beginning of George Harrison's solo career. Shortly after the band's breakup, George released All Things Must Pass, a triple album that showcased his incredible talent as a songwriter and musician. Free from the constraints of the Beatles, George was able to fully express himself, and the album was a massive success, both critically and commercially. As for Paul, he continued to lead a successful solo career, but the tension with George during the Let It Be sessions would forever be a part of their legacy. Paul would later reflect on this period with a mix of regret and understanding, acknowledging that the pressure of keeping the Beatles together had led to friction between him and George. In the end, the creative tension between George Harrison and Paul McCartney was a reflection of the larger issues facing the Beatles at the time. They were a band that had outgrown itself, with each member pulling in different directions. George's desire for artistic freedom clashed with Paul's need for control, and the result was the end of the Beatles as the world knew them. So, what do you think? Was George justified in pushing back against Paul's control, or was Paul just trying to keep the band together? Let's keep the conversation going in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this deep dive into one of the most iconic musical rivalries in history, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this video with your fellow Beatles fans. We've got plenty more timelines to unlock together, so stay tuned for more.